Governments call them threats to national security. Supporters call them our last hope in curbing the power of overreaching government institutions. Former NSA contractor Edward Snowden is maybe the most famous whistleblower on the planet right now, but another former NSA executive was his inspiration. Thomas Drake worked with and for the National Security Agency for almost 20 years. He is also a United States Air Force and Navy veteran. He has worked with the CIA. As well, he is a computer software expert. You could call him a whistleblower, but it would be oversimplifying his remarkable story. And Thomas Drake joins me this morning here in our studio in Toronto. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. I understand, though, that you had a bit of a problem getting into the country, a bit of a problem at the airport.
A little bit. As I was coming through customs, I was stopped for probably longer than I was expecting, even though I was anticipating the possibility, and was asked some rather probing questions about the purpose for my visit.
You had your passport and documents and everything?
All that was in order.
What were the questions? Why were
they want to know what the purpose of my trip was, and so I said I was giving a talk at the University of Toronto. Then they continued to persist with a line of questioning regarding what type of talk. And I mentioned it was on surveillance. I said, what type of surveillance? And I said, government. And then they said, is that based because of where you used to work? And I simply said, yes. Then the next question was, can you show us an invitation letter? Which is the first time I've ever been asked at any border for an invitation letter, other than countries in which I had to apply for a visa that required such a letter.
Want an invitation letter from the U of T?
An invitation letter from the U of T.
Yeah.
And what I showed the customs officer was my itinerary from the professor who's sponsoring the trip.
You are well known to intelligence authorities on both sides of the border. Perhaps it's not surprising that they were questioned a bit more closely.
Not surprising at all, actually. I was anticipating the possibility that I could be questioned.
Can be unnerving, though, I guess.
It's always a little unnerving.
How did you come to get involved in intelligence?
I joined the United States Air Force as an enlisted aircrew member in 1979 during the height of the Cold War.
Right.
And it was assigned to the Electronic Security Squadron for the United States Air Force under the authority of NSA, flying out of RAF Mildenhall against the Warsaw Pact.
And that led you to, in your civilian work, continuing with intelligence.
Yes, it did.
Can I use the word espionage for intelligence?
Are
they the same?
Espionage has actually a different connotation because that's more traditional spying. The work that I did was reconnaissance. We did vacuum up signals to understand
what is that?
Intelligence, signals intelligence, communications intelligence, electronic, anything that transmitted some kind of a signal. We called ourselves a vacuum cleaner of the skies back then.
You worked on a program called the Trailblazer Project, or Project Trailblazer. What was that all about?
That was one of the programs in which I became intimately familiar. It was NSA's flagship program. NSA had been severely challenged by the digital age. Ironically enough, for all of its legacy and prowess from the Cold War, it was really caught blind and deaf by the explosion of the digital age. Mm-hmm. Just extraordinary amounts of data, and they were just caught
behind the times.
Behind the times, had to play catch up. They knew it was a challenge problem, but instead of taking the very best of NSA and necessity being the mother of invention, a strategic decision was made by General Hayden to simply buy a solution.
Michael Hayden, who was
the former general, and then he later became the director of the CIA. He made a strategic decision in 2000 to spend billions and billions, at the time a $4 billion program, to catapult NSA into the 21st century.
Now, you had some concerns about the system then, and certainly now, but what were your worries?
Well, that particular program was the fact it was a massively fraudulent program. The core requirements for Trailblazer had already been met by another program in NSA that had been developed for $3 million called Thin Thread. But interestingly enough, Thin Thread not only provided superior intelligence, it had proven itself in some pilot tests, but it also was able to handle vast amounts of foreign intelligence and make sense of it.
Right.
And also do so while absolutely protecting the rights of citizens under the United States Constitution.
Now, that protection of the rights of citizens, that gave you some growing concerns. Especially after 9/11.
After 9/11, and this is completely separate from Trailblazer because they're often conflated or mixed.
Yeah.
Because Trailblazer was a traditional system just to deal with foreign intelligence. Stellar Wind was this super secret domestic surveillance program. It basically turned the United States into the equivalent of a foreign nation for dragnet blanket surveillance. This is why I've been reliving the past 12 years in light of the 6 months of disclosures that we're now seeing from Edward Snowden. That particular program was authorized by the White House.
After 9/11.
Right after 9/11, and NSA became the executive agent for the program, initially sweeping up bulk copy records, phone records, millions and millions and millions. Similar to what we're hearing even in the latest disclosures and revelations of today.
Now, were these sweeping up operations illegal? Because as I understand it, warrantless wiretaps, although being conducted, were illegal. You had to go before a judge at a special court, a FISA court.
That is correct.
To get a warrant.
Yes, because of abuses over several decades, as it turns out, culminating in the Nixon era in the 1970s. So there was a law in place. It had criminal sanctions, $10,000 fine, 5 years in prison for every violation. If you did not have a warrant going after a U.S. person who you suspected, based on probable cause evidence, was up to no good in terms of harm or damage to U.S. national security interests. They completely bypassed that. After 9/11, there was no Constitution, let alone a Fourth Amendment. The government unchained itself from the law of the land, and just in the deepest of secrecy began to sweep up vast amounts of electronic records on just about anything it could find, and starting with phone numbers, and then emails, and then financial records, credit card information, and internet usage.
And they covered reporters and news agencies.
Yes, they had a special program that did that as well.
How did you respond to all this? As an employee and as somebody who was steeped in intelligence, what was your reaction? Privately?
I realized the grave risk, the grave threat to the Constitution. And I knew that what had been opened up was Pandora's box. And I knew that the strategic consequences downstream, even though they would not be realized immediately, were quite significant. And I knew that if I remained silent, that I would be an accessory to a crime.
The crime being
the subversion of the Constitution. And I had taken an oath 4 times. This was, I had just taken the oath as a senior executive a few weeks earlier during in-processing at NSA. And that oath was to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Were you able to somehow exercise your concerns within the agency, to go up the ladder? Were there protocols in place where internally you could go and say, look, I'm really worried about this. We're on very dangerous ground.
Yes, there were protocols. The immediate one was to my reporting official, who was the number 3 person and headed up the Signals Intelligence Directorate at NSA. I subsequently spoke directly in the first week in October of a chilling conversation with the lead attorney at NSA, who told me that the White House had approved the program, it was all legal, that NSA was the executive agent for what they called it, the program. It was Stellar Wind, but don't ask any more questions.
When you raised these concerns inside the agency, what was the response?
Well, they said, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. We live in extraordinary times, so we have to have extraordinary means. And I said, well, under our Constitution, if the law, which was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which had been modified 5 times since 1978 when it was passed under the Carter administration, there is a constitutional means to change the law, update the law, or even pass new legislation, have it signed into law by the president. And they said if we do that, they'll say no.
You knew, of course, better than anyone, that the United States government was dealing with some very nasty people and some very dangerous situations. Nobody wanted a repeat of 9/11, and the feeling, I think, was felt on this side of the border, whatever it takes.
Yeah, whatever it takes was probably articulated by Cheney 5 days after 9/11, where we're going to go to the dark side. I don't think people fully appreciated what that meant. It certainly didn't mean that we abandoned the Constitution. It certainly didn't mean that we abandoned the rule of law, and it certainly didn't mean abandon what it means to be American in terms of our own history and the grand experiment. You don't sacrifice all your liberties and freedoms for the sake of security. Benjamin Franklin actually had a very telling quote about that, because you end up losing both. But it is true. 9/11, it was a fundamental systemic failure. And although the workforce overwhelmingly realized we had failed the nation and even the rest of the world, we were unable to keep people out of harm's way, including foreign citizens, others at NSA, particularly the leadership level, took it differently. And they decided to use that as an excuse to access vast amounts of information in absolute violation of the law, irrespective of what would happen if you did so.
You had top security clearance, I take it?
Yes.
To see documents and reports and all that. I understand that there's something like 2.5 million people in the U.S. that have security clearance.
It's actually higher than that.
Really?
Yeah, it's upwards of 4 million plus. Actually approaching 5 million to have some kind of a clearance that gives them access to special information. Okay,
you got no satisfaction internally. What did you decide to do?
Well, remember, none of this was necessary. The very best of American ingenuity and inventiveness had actually solved this problem. It was never permitted to go out operationally. In fact, even Congress, right after January of 2002, when they passed the Intelligence Authorization Act, directed, and it was passed into law by President Bush, directing NSA to deploy thin thread to the 18 most critical counterterrorism sites. They absolutely defied the law and the legislation. And so I ended up becoming a material witness for 2 9/11 congressional investigations. Unfortunately, all that evidence, material evidence, hundreds, thousands of pages of evidence, was actually censored and suppressed.
But you took some pages home. You took documents and reports home with you.
Well, when I left NSA, this was several years later, to became a visiting professor of behavioral science at the National Defense University in leadership, strategic leadership strategies and ethics, information strategies. I was cleaning out my office, and I had already been advised by the investigator some years earlier in another investigation which I was a part of with the Department of Defense, looking at the requirements for Thin Thread and Trailblazer, anything that was unclassified, to retain. And so I did.
That was the word used, retain.
To retain, yeah. Except they turned that around and framed me. It was all unclassified information.
My guest this morning is Thomas Drake. He's a former senior executive with the United States National Security Agency. He worked there for almost 20 years. You were ultimately charged by your government in a 10-count indictment, which virtually called you an enemy of the state.
That's precisely what they called me, that blood would be on my hands, that I endangered the lives of American soldiers.
Yeah, and facing what? In terms, had you been convicted, facing
35 years in prison.
35 years in jail.
In fact, at one point during the investigation, which was launched on a massive scale because of the James Risen, Eric Lichtblau article that was
This
published.
was in the New York Times about warrantless wiretapping.
Revealing for the first time that this program, the super secret program, existed in clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, clear violation of the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And it caused quite a stir. Well, but instead of dealing with it, instead of actually acknowledging that we just decided to abandon the Constitution, they decided to open up a criminal leak investigation. I got caught up by virtue of association in that investigation.
You told somebody that you said, quote, "I have a bullseye on my back."
Yes.
You were targeted.
Oh, yeah. I was not only targeted, they actually thought that I was a ringleader for the disclosures to the New York Times. They actually made me out to be much more than I really was.
Now, the prosecutors maintain that you were charged based on the merits of the case and not as a warning to other whistleblowers. What do you think?
That's completely false. The reality, it was to send the most chilling of messages. Anybody who dares speak truth to enough power is going to be hammered and hammered good. And even worse, even more chilling, it's sending a direct message to journalists and reporters that we're on to your sources.
How did you go through those days? How did that affect you?
It was extremely difficult. I mean, remember at one point during their investigation, they actually said that they threatened me with spending the rest of my life in prison if I didn't cooperate with their investigation. They ultimately found a way to charge me in a 10 felony count indictment. 5 of those counts were under the Espionage Act. That puts
They were calling you a spy.
Literally. And
a traitor, really.
I was the second whistleblower since Daniel Ellsberg. In fact, only the 4th person in U.S. history to be charged in like manner. Ellsberg was the first. So even those organizations who would be your natural allies, civil liberties, like ACLU, for example, constitutional rights groups, as well as others, were hands off, because to be charged as a spy is about the worst thing you can call an American. You're essentially a Benedict Arnold. You were once one of us, now you're one of them. And you're painted into a very, very dark corner, and you're actually put into the same category, the same league as the Aldrich Ames, the Robert Hansons.
Who were spies, who were
the real spies are the Alger Hisses of the world.
Yeah. How did you, with your family or your personal life, what did it do to you?
Totally upended.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, and of course, the nightmare had only begun because I realized it was a matter of when, not if, that they would actually charge me. It was pretty clear that they were going to do everything they could to charge me. And so they ended up raiding my house in 2007. They tossed it. They took everything they could get their hands on in terms of anything that would implicate me, or they could use to implicate me later, which was really a frame up. And then 2.5 years later, I actually got indicted. So that's when the second part of the nightmare began. And it was a very public indictment.
You made a point of not leaking classified information.
Yes.
Why not?
Because I had signed a non-disclosure agreement. I knew what was classified and what wasn't. I mean, I had gone through many, many years of training, and it was unnecessary. Even though I did ultimately go to reporter in February of 2006.
That was the Baltimore Sun reporter.
Baltimore Sun, although it turned out it was a red herring. They really thought I was a source for the New York Times.
Yeah.
And because there was no evidence, that sent I was a really, really good spy.
But if you were going to tell the American public what was going on in their name, why not release classified information?
I didn't need to.
It'd be a violation of your oath, or what?
Well, the oath was to the Constitution. That takes primacy over everything else. The non-disclosure agreement, by the way, does not mean, even if you stamp something classified, that you use that as cover to violate the law. You use that as cover for wrongdoing or illegality, or to protect the fact that you did not provide for the public safety. I mean, that's classic whistleblowing. And so what they ended up doing is criminalizing my whistleblowing. But I didn't need to actually provide classified information to any reporter. But I knew that going to the press was fraught with peril, and that at a minimum I could end up losing my job and that my career was gone. That I knew. And there was the possibility of even worse.
You were facing, as you said, 35 years in prison if convicted, and that your government was referring to you as an enemy of the state. And yet, hours, days before you were to come to trial, they dropped all the charges.
Well, that was a plea agreement on my terms. Their case had actually collapsed in the courtroom before the judge. They were unable to make the heart of their case, which was essentially, you retain this for the purpose of giving it to a reporter. That was really their argument. And they were unable to prevail on that point. However, they still had other options, and I knew that. They could have kicked it upstairs for higher review, which would have suspended the case. And so it was one of those moments where right before, it was right on the eve of my public trial, which interestingly enough was the 40th anniversary of the publication of the Pentagon Papers. In fact, Ellsberg was ready to come to Baltimore and stand on the courthouse steps and give civic lessons as to why what was going on inside the courtroom was so critical.
But these prosecutors and these state's attorneys or whatever they're not dumb.
No.
Why would they go ahead with a case with little expectation of a conviction that ultimately falls apart?
I actually think they expected that they had a good chance for a conviction because it was so rare to be charged in this manner, and because of the times and because of the evidence they had, by calling it tippy-top classified, that I really truly had compromised.
Tippy-top?
Tippy-top, yeah, because that's what they did. They actually classified at the highest level, even though it wasn't classified. It didn't matter that it was actually unclassified. They alleged that it was the most classified information that you could stamp it with. And so they thought they could prevail, and they made a good run at it. There's no question, because unfortunately, because it's involving national security, there's special procedures involved where the courtroom basically is sequestered and it's non-public. There's very, very few of the hearings, and there was any number of hearings. Most of the hearings were sealed.
What do you think of people like, well, not people like, what do you think of Edward Snowden, Julian Assange?
Well, Julian Assange, he's a publisher, and he's part of the new wave of media in the 21st century in the digital era. and he's also a place in which whistleblowers, and that was a sense what they were set up for, truth tellers could go and receive protection. In terms of Edward Snowden, extraordinary disclosures. I've said it's a magnificent act of civil disobedience. I regard him as a fellow NSA whistleblower.
You regard him as a crook?
I do not regard him as a crook. I regard him as one who saw massive surveillance, state-sponsored surveillance, violating all kinds of laws, and including the laws of citizens in other countries, not just the United States.
Do you regard him as a patriot?
I don't put that label as a convenient label. Patriot is a overused, overloaded word to say it that way. I simply regard him as he was convicted by the truth, and he did not want to see a world that would end up under the boot of surveillance. Remember, it's 12. He had studied my case very carefully, and he knew that the explosive nature of his documents, he would have to escape the United States in order to have any chance of remaining free enough to get him into the hands of the journalist reporters that he chose.
Well, you were something of an inspiration for him.
He actually has said that publicly.
He has said that.
And he shared words to that effect in private as well.
Mr. Drake, in this country, we don't like to think of ourselves as being involved in spies and espionage. We I think, cling to the World War I British diplomat who said, "Gentlemen, don't read other gentlemen's mail." But we do have this communications security establishment, Canada. How concerned should Canadians be about this kind of thing?
Be quite concerned. I mean, Canada, the CSEC is part of the Five Eyes. And the Five Eyes community...
Who are the Five Eyes?
Well, the Five Eyes is composed of the signals intelligence services, the security services of the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It's a very, very close partnership.
We had the leaders of the world's great nations in this country in 2010, and they met in a resort area north of the city, and they met in Toronto. We now find out that the NSA and CSEC covered the meetings. We don't know what they did. Probably there were mail covers or wiretaps, or I don't know what all went on, but is that the kind of thing that should go on in this country or in yours?
No, but I understand it does. And with the technology of today, it's extraordinarily tempting in secret to pretty much surveil, spy on anybody, anything you get your hands on. And you're talking about a significant conference of world leaders at the very top level in the top countries in the country, in the world, meeting here in Toronto. And if you have arrangements, then you can find out an awful lot beyond just traditional threats.
But why would Barack Obama, Mr. Transparency, allow such a thing, or allow, for example, hacking into Angela Merkel's cell phone? You've said publicly that you think President Obama has been co-opted by the intelligence community.
But he's also embraced secrecy. He loves secrecy. He's just eaten up by secrecy. He's a secrecy president, far more than even Bush. He's essentially pipelining it. Some would say he's even mainlining it. He's addicted to secrecy because he's getting information from intercepts of world leaders. And it also gives them a huge advantage in negotiations.
But isn't that a violation of Canadian sovereignty or UK or German sovereignty?
I'll parrot back the words of the U.S. government when they were confronted with that question regarding why would you spy on Angela Merkel's personal cell phone, which called a handy in German, since 2002, even before she became the chancellor when she was head of the opposition party. Hey, all foreign leaders should expect they can be spied upon. It was just extraordinary arrogance to say that you would just, hey, if we can get away with it, that's essentially what they're saying. That's the short version. If we can get away with it, we're going to do it.
But had the opposite occurred and President Obama's cell phone had been hacked, the reaction would have been fearsome.
Yeah, but that's the hypocrisy, isn't it? I mean, that's that American exceptionalism. Is
it the fact that President Obama has prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other administration, even the Bush administration?
Actually, all other administrations combined.
Really?
We're up to like 8, I believe now, who've actually been formally charged with espionage under the same charges that I was the first.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a president who is extraordinarily ruthless and relentless and going after those who he believes are disclosing unauthorized information.
But what do you do when you're faced with enemies, not necessarily states, but independent contractors, if you will, who are enemies of the West? You have industrial espionage. Canada's been accused of spying on a cabinet minister in Brazil. Just this week, we've had a Chinese engineer in this country charged with allegedly selling secrets back to China. Don't we have to do something?
Well, yeah. If you're talking about like selling secrets to a foreign country for gain or for ego
right.
or to make a point, then yes. I mean, I'd be the first to say then there's a legitimate reason to protect that and to go after those who would. But on the other hand, if the government itself is engaged in wrongdoing and illegality, then who's watching the watchers?
But isn't it the fact that people like you and Daniel Ellsberg and Edward Snowden can come out with this information and the government will either roll over on you or ignore you?
Yes.
That it's not going to change?
Well, I wouldn't continue to be on shows like yours or any other media outlets if I didn't believe that it wasn't worth it. Meaning, I think there's too much at stake for society. Do we really want to sacrifice the heart of democracy and our liberties and freedoms for national security or a security state? I mean, one of the things that we have to wrestle with here is what do we lose in society? History is not kind at all here. It really isn't. I mean, we've had very dark chapters in the 20th century in particular as object lessons and what happens when you clamp down on liberties and freedoms for the sake of the state. And so if you're going to forsake the fundamental nature of what I consider sovereign rights, natural law, sovereign rights of human beings, to protect the state, well, this speaks of the Soviet Union era, this speaks of the Nazi era as well.
But isn't it true that the primary characteristic of the national security state is that everybody's an enemy?
Yes. By definition, everybody's suspicious. There is no presumed innocence. And this is what's so pernicious about sweeping up vast amounts of information on individual people. And although they'll claim, well, if you have nothing to worry about, if you have nothing to hide, that phrase, guess who's actually in history is attributed to having launched that phrase? Goebbels from the Nazi era.
There was a case a couple of weeks ago of a woman traveling to the U.S. who was stopped at the border and turned back because the American border officials found out she had been treated for depression some years ago. The question is, how did that information get to the American border officials? Was it handed over by the police, by our people? How does a thing like that happen and nothing is done?
There's a national security cutout for health records right now. If, in fact, I remember a couple of years ago when I had an ingrown toenail. It was an outpatient visit for an ingrown toenail. I had to sign a release form, and on there it said these records can be authorized for release for national security purposes.
Come on.
Not kidding. If a national security authority comes along and says we need those records, yes.
So we're all living under a bubble.
We are,
and everyone's watching and listening. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And what effect? That's a corrosive effect on who we are.
It makes you wonder who's running things, doesn't it?
Yeah, and in the wrong hands. Because some people said, well, we'll give the moral rectitude to President Obama, but what about a president who may not have the same moral rectitude?
Yeah.
Although I believe that's just hypocrisy. But someone later on who has other things in mind. There's already enough evidence, even in the Obama administration, the abuse of power. The temptations are huge to use it against political enemies, to use it as leverage against others. I mean, just imagine, I knew this from inside NSA, that there was a special program that was monitoring on a very large scale journalists and reporters. That means that they're actually monitoring to see who they're in contact with, who they're communicating with, who might come to them with information, even ahead of time, before anything is even published. Is that the kind of society we really want to live in?
Mr. Drake, it's a pleasure to meet you on the radio. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thomas Drake is a former senior executive with the United States National Security Agency. He worked there for almost 20 years. His reward for that was being charged by the American government as a threat to the state. All those charges were subsequently dropped.